All right. Let me see if I can get this here. Aha, I have not shared the link, have I? That would explain a lot. Okay, let's do this. Okay, we should not go over 1 o'clock. It should not be a problem. So, we've got... Here we go. I'm going to turn off the volume because I'm getting all sorts of echo and feedback. There's a little bit of latency between the time that I speak and the time that you're actually hearing me, but I'm going to try to be up on the comments, but no guarantees on that. I have to manage between a couple of different windows. All right, so first up, we're going to be talking about... So he's got this whole axe to grind against calling anybody the Great. One thing he says, it's sexist. Probably some truth to that. It does generally tend to be male leaders who get called the Great. But it's not exclusively male leaders who are called the Great, because Catherine the Great of Russia is certainly called the Great. Can you guys hear? I wonder if when I put that picture up, so was it when I put the picture up? Is that when the volume went away? Ah, so maybe I can't put the pictures up without having the audio go away too. Well, that kind of stinks. There's got to be a way to make it so that I can show that without the volume going away. I got it. I know how to do it. So you guys can still hear me, right? You guys can still hear me now, right? Even though it's not my pretty face on the screen, you guys can still hear me? Yes? Good, I figured it out. So, anybody guess what this is a picture of? Has something to do with Alexander the Great. And I will continue to refer to him as Alexander the Great, regardless of what John Green's preferences are. Anybody have a guess as to what this picture is a picture of? This is a young Alexander on his chair being taught by somebody. Yeah, that's Aristotle seated in front of Alexander and teaching him. So that may or may not be what you pictured as Aristotle, but that's Aristotle teaching Alexander the Great. So, all right, so now I know how to do this. We're going to look at these pictures at some point in time during the day. I'm just going to set them up so that we can be good to go with them. There we go. All right, back to me. Hi. So, John Green says basically it's sexist because it's almost always men who are called the Great, although Catherine the Great is the exception to that, the Russian Tsarina. And there are other women who should be called the Great. Elizabeth I should be called Elizabeth the Great. Victoria should be called Victoria the Great. But then you have a problem because Elizabeth II's pretty great too. So what do you call her? Elizabeth the also great? I think there may be another explanation other than pure sexism for why it is that it's mostly men who are called the great. For example, it may be national. Who can think of kings of England who are known as the Great? Any kings of England known as the Great? Henry VIII? Is he called Henry the Great? No. Edward, the one whose name is lent to Edwardian England, is he known as Edward the Great? Richard the Lionhearted, but is he called Richard the Great? No. So I think some of why people get called the Great or not the Great has to do with nationality and not necessarily with gender. So, you know, in Russia you have Ivan the Terrible. He's a guy, and he's known as the Terrible. So of course, if you've seen Night at the Museum Battle for the Smithsonian, you'll know that he corrects it and says it's really Ivan the Awesome, which it's not. It's just a joke for the movie. But anyway, so maybe it has to do with nationality, why some people get called great and some people don't. There is one king in the history of England who is known as the Great, and that is King Alfred the Great. But he's pretty important. Does anyone know what Alfred the Great's accomplishment was within the history of England? Oh, Carolyn got it. Alfred the Great. What a good old... First of all, he is the inspiration for two of the most common names in the English language, Al and Fred. Not really, but sounds good, right? Alfred the Great. He was the first king of England. He was the guy who united the various tribes that were in what we call today England, and united them together to form England. And so he is known as Alfred the Great. Anyway, greatness. What is greatness? Why should these kings be called great and not some faithful peasant working in his blacksmith shop or in his carpenter's shop? Why not? Why wouldn't they be called the Great? Well, typically, historically, we reserve the title of great for rulers who were transformative in nature. So the rulers whose reign and rule was so influential that it changed everything after them. So Alfred the Great is known as Alfred the Great in English history because he creates England. And everything is going to be different after him than it was before him. You go from a group of tribes in an area to a unified country and a monarchy that essentially still stands today. Alexander is known as Alexander the Great because he creates what becomes known as the Greco-Roman world. Now, you don't have to like him or think he's a nice guy or, you know, want to sit down and have dinner with him or think that he was, you know, heroic, but you can't deny this basic truth, and that is Alexander had more of an impact upon the world than almost any other ruler in history. And I'm going to make this case here based upon a couple of things. First, he conquered a broader territory than had ever been conquered in the history of the world up until that time. Second, he united a more diverse collection of peoples under one government, even if for only a brief period of time. Third, he becomes the precursor to the Roman Empire, which would conquer much of that same territory again, but later. And much of the area that he conquers, Greek becomes their language, and the Greek culture becomes their culture for like 2,000 years. So if you tie together the beginning of the Alexander the Great video all the way to the end of the Fall of Rome video. At the end of the Fall of Rome, John Green makes the point that Rome didn't really fall in 476 because it remained in the Byzantine Empire for another 1,000 years. It didn't fall until about the year 1500 when you had the fall of Constantinople and the final conquering of the Byzantine Empire by the Ottoman Empire. And that's true. But when you consider the fact that the Eastern Mediterranean speaks Greek and has Greek as their culture, not only the Greek language, but Greek philosophy and Greek ideals, like the games and the laws that go back to Rome, but then before that to Greece. When you think about that, you really have to credit Alexander the Great with a lot of that. Because not only did he conquer a wide area, but he also put into place institutions that would teach the Greek language, and that would teach Greek philosophy, and that would teach the history of Greek lawmaking and justice. So he does more than just win a bunch of battles and conquer a bunch of land. He really has a profound impact on world history. So it begins with his education. He was educated by Aristotle, who of course himself had been educated by Plato, who had been educated by Socrates. So this great trio of Greek philosophy becomes sort of the source for many of Alexander the Great's cultural ideas. Not so much his military strategy, right, which he gets more from his father, Philip of Macedon, but the cultural ideas come from this tradition of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And that's important because Alexander, when he spreads over the known world, is going to take the Greek culture with him. And he takes over a lot of territory in an incredibly short amount of time. So he expands from Macedon and Greece all the way down through Egypt, through all of the Middle East, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Israel, Jordan, all the way over to what's today Afghanistan and Pakistan, right? All the way up to the Indus River Valley. So he conquers a massive amount of territory. Now, John Green says that this is the first reason for Alexander's greatness. The first reason for Alexander's greatness, question number 4 in your note-taking sheet, is because he was a great military general who conquered the most powerful empire in the then known world, the Persian Empire, and spread, farther than anyone else had ever spread. And that's true. That's the first reason for his greatness. However, Alexander was not very good at training up a successor to take his place. Now, this is something that John Green points out. I would like to give Alexander the benefit of the doubt, however, because, look, the guy died really young after a very short reign. So he accomplishes all of this in just a few years, and then he dies at a really young age. And so he wasn't prepared yet to leave and to leave his empire to a successor. And so after he dies, his empire gets divided up into 4, and they end up, becoming, a couple of them get conquered by outside forces, etc., etc. But the amount of territory that he conquers, and even in the places where they fall, he had still established schools and libraries and academies. Aristotle had formed an academy in Athens, and then that becomes the academy model that Alexander spreads all over the known world. When he died, by the way, they had a pretty impressive funeral. Can somebody count the number of horses that it required to pull his coffin? So this is based upon an eyewitness account that was written at the time. This piece of artwork wasn't made until the 19th century, the 1800s, but when it was made based upon the eyewitness accounts. And this is a recreation of the state funeral for Alexander the Great. It's quite a massive hearse he has there. Lots and lots of horses required to pull it. It's like a little temple, right? And then you see his cavalry all around him. Yeah, it's a lot. It's probably 100 horses or something like that. Yeah. So the guy was well loved. He was incredibly influential. It's hard to deny that. It's hard to deny the impact that he had upon the world. So that's the second reason for Alexander's greatness, is that he influenced the areas that he conquered by introducing the Greek language and Greek culture, statues, laws, institutions. He really created what we know as the Hellenistic world. So there's two different words that get used a lot. You'll read these and hear these. There's Hellenic, and then there's Hellenistic. And you might think they're the same thing, but they're not. Hellenic refers to classical Greece. It refers to basically the Athenian culture of Sophocles, the playwright, and Socrates and Plato, and Solon, the lawgiver. So the Hellenic culture is classical Athenian Greek culture. Hellenistic culture, you add that little istic on the end there, Hellenistic culture is the culture that Alexander the Great was responsible for spreading throughout the world. It's based upon Hellenism, but Hellenistic culture is more empire-oriented, more power and glory-oriented, and not as refined, I guess we would say. So that's the second reason for his greatness, is because of the influence that he had. He created this Hellenistic culture which really spread and really changed the world. Remember, Roman culture is just an imitation of Greek culture. Well, whose Greek culture were they imitating? That which was made popular by Alexander the Great. So this heritage that gets passed down is passed down for years. Okay, the third greatness of Alexander is the fact that he was a hero to so many later rulers and generals. So many people who came after him thought he was the man, and they intentionally styled themselves after him in the way that they carried themselves, in the way that they dressed, in the way that they fought battles, in the way that they sought empires. They looked at him as the model, and they thought, if only he hadn't died so young. So I'll do everything he did, but I won't die as young, and I'll be the next Alexander. So Julius Caesar and Pompey and lots and lots, Napoleon, lots and lots of world-conquering, empire-building mighty men looked to Alexander as their role model. And so, again, he's wrestling in this video with the idea of greatness. And I would say he makes a very good point at the end of the video, and that is, we as a culture, in a sense, we kind of choose what we decide we are going to celebrate as great. And it's sad that in our culture, we basically celebrate celebrity, right? So the Kardashians, or singers and actors and actresses and athletes, and the British royalty, which I don't get the American obsession with British royalty. Like, they have no real power, and they're not our royalty. Our royalty are the Kardashians. That's just sad. Okay. So we have this celebrity-obsessed culture, but there is some truth to say, look, if nobody bought those magazines, if nobody watched those television programs, if nobody cared about those people, then maybe they would go away, and maybe we could have a conversation about what does make someone great, and maybe we could celebrate people who are worth celebrating. We try to do that somewhat. We try to celebrate the military and people who sacrifice themselves in battle for us. We give lip service to teachers as being kind of great, but it's a little bit problematic, this idea of greatness. Okay, now the next thing that was talked about was this thing. What is this thing? Yes, the Silk Road. Now, if you look carefully at this image, I like it because it gives you a good understanding of what was kind of picked up where. So each area from east to west had things that they made that were valuable. The way that trade works is I'm not going to give you something of value unless I can get something of value. And, you know, precious metals are, of course, sort of universally valuable, so gold and silver could be traded up and down. But really, for a trade route to go both ways, you have to have things of value to trade. So if you look in the far west, in Constantinople, there's wine coming out of Europe, there's woven goods, and there's metal work that's very fine and very valuable. All right, and then if you look all the way in the east, in Jiangsu, in China, you have silk and hemp and cotton. And then a little bit south of there in Guangzhou, you have ceramics and tea and sugar. So, and everybody along the line there has something of value that they kind of contribute to this trade. So we call it the Silk Road, and the reason why it's called the Silk Road is because the most valuable thing that was traded along this route, and sort of the reason for the route existing, was silk. Silk is incredibly strong, silk is incredibly lightweight, it can keep you warm when it's cold, it can help you be cool when it's hot. We imitate some of the effects of silk by making polyester shirts. This shirt's made out of 100% polyester, which is, of course, sort of a plasticky compound made from oil. But it's not silk, because if this was silk, it would cost me a whole lot more money, and I'm not spending that kind of money on clothes. So, so this kind of fabric, though, the one that's breathable, that's cool to wear when it's hot outside, and is warm to wear when it's cold outside, was very, very valuable. And silk is incredibly valuable because it's so rare. You can't. Spiders make silk, right? You ever seen a spider farm? Or silkworms make silk, and you can get them to be on a farm. But there's a difference. Oh, bye, Autumn. Didn't miss you going there. See ya. So, because it comes from animals and it's no artificial way to make it, we've kind of reproduced it with oil, with polyester, but it's a very, very poor imitation, right? Because it comes from spiders or worms, it's very difficult to get massive quantities of it because it's coming out of an animal, right? Spider silk, by the way, is even stronger than silkworm silk, and so they're working on ways. Have I told you guys about the silk goats, the spider goats? Someone spliced in some orb weaving spider DNA into goats, and now those goats put out milk that has spider silk in it. You can actually like spin it and make threads. And because goats, you can farm goats a lot more easily than you can farm spiders. And also you get a lot more quantity of goat milk than you do spider silk. So anyway, the point is that the world is still trying to make silk, right? Here we are thousands of years later. But this trade route, this Silk Road, it sort of created a bridge between the East and the West, right? And created trade routes that connected China and Mongolia and Central Asia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, to the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Arabia, to Europe. Now, this was a very long and very complicated and very difficult way to trade goods because there would be markup every stop along the way. So every time one merchant sold off to another merchant, he's going to increase the price so that he makes a profit off of it. So if something starts off costing 1 gold coin in China, by the time it gets to Constantinople, it might cost you 10 gold coins because every trader along the way has gotten his cut. Eventually, this trade route will inspire the age of exploration, which we'll get to in a couple of months, because Europeans started looking for a way around this trade route. This was a very expensive, very time-consuming, very cumbersome way to move goods and services, and so they wanted to get around it. That's why 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and why when he arrived in Hispaniola, he thought in the Caribbean, he thought he was in the Indies, and why he called them the Indies, and why we call Native Americans Indians. It all comes back to this Silk Road. So it's very important. So the Chinese government had a monopoly on making silk, and they kept it a monopoly because they were interested in having all the power. So that's one of the themes that we've gotten so far in this world history class, is that China was controlled by a bureaucracy that was in support of the emperor, and that it was sort of against free enterprise, right? So you see all the things that were traded along the route, okay? And how did the Silk Road help the people of Central Asia? Well, it gave them a vital role to play in this east-west commerce. It gave them a key role within an economy, right? Now, he makes the point that, like, the only people in Europe who were wearing silk were incredibly wealthy people. And really the only people who could end up affording to buy the products that came off of the Silk Road on the European end were the very wealthy. So here's a whole trade network that's set up to serve the rich elite. But that doesn't mean that middle class and working class people didn't benefit from it. Because anytime something is bought and sold, you have to have somebody who makes that. So people who made wine and made metalworks in Europe, and people who made jade sculptures, and people who made other goods that were traded along the route. All of the manufacturers, it may be true that the silk itself was controlled by the Chinese government, but there were other textiles and other gold and silver and lapis lazuli and little statues of horses and ceramic ware that was made by all sorts of people. And so all those people got to benefit from this trade route, but also, you know, people who carried it, the merchants, the tradesmen got to benefit from it. And the people of Europe got to benefit from it because it brought them the plague, which killed half of them. So that's a good thing, right? Maybe not. But still, trade is the kind of thing, this is another huge theme in world history. I put the Silk Road sheet up on the on Schoology. It's session number 9, video number 9. I put it up on Schoology. It's on the resources page. I didn't hand it out in class, but I put the PDF up online so you could print it. All right. Trade. Got sidetracked by the comments. Trade is an important element of world history. It is still an important element in global discussions. In many ways, the reason why Donald Trump was elected President of the United States is because of globalization. Globalization that shrinks the world and increases the amount of trade in the world, it tends to move labor, unskilled labor jobs tend to get moved to wherever the labor is cheapest. So instead of making something in Peoria, Illinois, you make it in Cambodia or Laos or Vietnam or China, because the people there get paid a lot less. And so if you're running a company and you're making iPhones, for example, like Steve Jobs, he made the iPhones in China and not in California. His company was headquartered in California, but they made them in China because they were cheaper to make, and there was less government bureaucracy. Actually, in a communist country, there's less government bureaucracy than there is in America. And so the workers, they weren't unionized, and so they got paid less, but they also were very flexible in that if he had a last-minute design change, they could just go ahead and change it. So what ends up happening in globalization is that jobs tend to get put wherever they can be done for the best at the lowest cost. And that's why Trump got elected, essentially, is because working class, blue-collar Americans who were tired of seeing manufacturing jobs go overseas and be replaced by low-paying retail jobs. They used to work at a steel mill and now they work at Walmart. Those people were sick of it, and so they elected somebody who promised to change it. So all that to say, trade is a hugely important part of world history. And along the Silk Road, there were new cities that were formed. So you can look at a map of the Silk Road, and you can find new cities that have been created all along that road because of they became major trading sites, right? Let's see if I can get you a map that would help you see that better. And then I put it up here. And now the audio's back. Okay, so this doesn't really show you cities. That's not the one I wanted to show you. Okay, but it's good enough. You get major cities that pop up along here, and they exist solely because they are part of the trade route and not really for any other reason. The Roman government tried to ban the importation of silk. It was a threat to local fabrics, right? And we talked about the rest of these things, so hopefully you got the answers. How did the Silk Road change the social and political hierarchy of some areas? Well, people became wealthy. Like, there's this whole family called the Medicis, who end up becoming the patrons of the Renaissance, but also like hugely influential in Italy. And they get that way because they control the trade to the east. So it creates new families of power and new sources of power through trade. Change the lives of ordinary people because all of a sudden you could be involved in a network far bigger than you could have been involved with before. You could do new things, you could go new places, and it did spread diseases, including the plague that came along the Silk Road to Europe. All right, that's enough of that. That's enough of that. All right, Rome. We talked about Rome in class, but who are the patricians and the plebeians? Who wants to tell me that answer? Who's the patricians and who's the plebeians? Anybody? Anybody? Bueller? Bueller? Yes. Right. Essentially, the patricians were the rich people and the plebeians were the poor, but patricians were nobles, plebeians were everybody else. You also had slaves, right? Yeah. So what's interesting here and what John Green says, the Senate was made up of patricians, but that's not entirely true. There was a plebeian council fairly early on, And then there was a push for the rights of the plebes so that plebes could have people in the Senate as well. So John Green tends to talk very quickly and paint with a broad brushstroke and gloss over lots of things that are important. Okay, so here's the Senate. Why is the Senate important, and how does it distinguish Rome from other ancient empires? Well, it is a representative, deliberative body, and it does create the laws for the empire. So it is important that you have a group of people who are elected, who represent certain constituencies, and who deliberate together to make laws. This is really an important institution, and it becomes model setting for the rest of the world. But one of the problems that happens, of course, is that as Rome gets bigger and bigger and spreads farther and farther, it becomes more and more difficult to try to effectively administrate the whole. So this is as big as Rome gets. This is right before the year 400, and so this is right before Rome starts to fall. Look at how massive Rome is by this time in its history. So here's an earlier shot, okay, and this is, the green is the Rome right after the Punic Wars, when they defeat Carthage, right? And then the orange gets added on by about the year 100 BC, okay? So think about, so you go from this, just the green, to then just the green and the orange, until eventually you have all of this. So as a massive, massive empire expands, you bring in more and more peoples from farther and farther away, and there's more and more interest groups and more constituencies, and it becomes very, very difficult to govern effectively a group so large. How big is this compared to the United States? Let me see if I can find a size comparison for you. Here's a decent picture. Ooh. Let's see if I can get this up. Where'd it go? There it is. Then I need to change audio, so when we switch to it, I will drop out. Okay, so here we go. Here's a size comparison of just the continental United States. Of course, we always forget about Alaska. Alaska is huge, land-wise, but so the United States is pretty big. Yeah, so there are definitely comparisons to be drawn when you say a wide geographic area, people who live a far distance away from the centers of power, a very diverse group of people, of very diverse interests, and it just becomes difficult to govern such an expansive area over time. Is that a helpful comparison? go through the questions here, because we're running out of time. So, why did Rome need consuls, and what were their job limitations? Well, the Senate, so a Senate is a good body for making laws, but a Senate is not a good body for running things, because it's hard to get 100 and some odd guys to actually be able to run something. So when you're making a law, you want a deliberative body where there's input and there's deliberation, there's discussion, debate. But when it comes time to actually enact those laws and run the country, you generally want just one or two people in charge so they can sort of direct things. And that's what the consuls were. There were two initially, and they each served a one-year term. One was put over domestic affairs, one was put over foreign affairs. So one sort of ran the country administratively, and the other was sort of the military commander-in-chief. So the third question is, why did they also need a dictator, and who was the model of a good dictator? They didn't! And no one was. So, but of course, once you start thinking about, well, we just need someone who's in charge of everything, who can make things work, that's when dictators come into play. And Alexander the Great is kind of a hero to them, and Julius Caesar comes along as someone who takes over in that way too. So Julius Caesar. So another big question that was sort of wrestled with was Julius Caesar really that important in transforming Europe, or sorry, transforming Rome from republic to empire? Or was it already an empire and he just came in because it was almost sort of inevitable? Both John Green and Rodney Stark tend to be Caesar apologists and tend to think, well, you know, it was just sort of inevitable that they were going to end up with a dictator. And there's definitely some truth to that, because even after Caesar is killed by the Senate, you still end up with a dictator not long after with Caesar Augustus. But Caesar was a really, really powerful and really influential guy. And when he seized power, he sparked off a civil war. And so you have this civil war where the Senate takes control of the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and then Caesar takes control of the western part of the Roman Empire, which is very interesting if you just look at this map and think about it, because later, hundreds of years later, Rome is going to be split into east and west. And so there's already this history of east and west, and there's already this idea that the western part is more the Latin-oriented part, and the eastern part is more the Greek-oriented part. And notice that the eastern part has a lot of overlap with Alexander the Great's old empire, right? So looking at this map is fascinating when you understand history, because it kind of harkens back to what came before, when Alexander the Great ruled what was in red and pink, and what's going to come later when the red and pink becomes Byzantium, or the Eastern Roman Empire, that's going to endure until about the year 1500. But Julius Caesar splits this up when he takes power, because he had conquered Gaul, which is France. He had a center of power that was toward the west. And so the Senate takes control of what is toward the east. Caesar ends up winning this war. I had some cool video to show you, but we're not going to have time for it, so maybe I'll show it to you in class, or maybe you can just look it up online yourself. But anyway, so Caesar wins this war, and then it ends up that the Senate just has to assassinate him because they lost, and that was their only chance to get rid of him, is to assassinate him. All right, back to my smiling face. Okay. The first triumvirate, let me make sure I give you the right names here. So the first triumvirate was an alliance that was made up between Julius Caesar and Pompey and Marcus Crassus. And these three guys decided that they were going to share power and kind of be a three-headed monster of ruling Rome. And and it works for a little bit, but then of course there's always power struggles. And so Julius Caesar ends up really taking power, and the other guys end up getting pushed out. So, I'm sorry. The first triumvirate didn't have Julius Caesar; it had Gaius Caesar. Oh, sorry, Gaius is Julius. I always get these Roman names mixed up. I want to make sure I was telling the right thing. Okay, so yes, sorry. Get my facts straight. So you had Gaius Julius Caesar, and he's put in charge of Gaul, and then you had Marcus Crassus, right? And he was put in charge of Syria, or what's over in the Middle East. And then you have Pompey taking Spain. And they were going to sort of divide this up, but Caesar ends up becoming the most powerful, and he ends up being able to conquer the other guys and taking power from them. He crosses back into Rome with his army in tow. He crosses the Rubicon. He takes power. He announces himself to be, the emperor of all of Rome. He's able to defeat his enemies, and then he is able to become the supreme ruler, but they kill him. After they kill him, there is a second triumvirate that comes along, and this is a triumvirate between Caesar Augustus and Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus. So I have a... So they end up dividing up, that's pretty blurry, they end up dividing up the areas between the three of them, and of course Caesar Augustus ends up winning that battle, and again a triumvirate becomes a dictatorship. A triumvirate becomes an emperorship, this time for Caesar Augustus, and this time it kind of sticks, right? Nobody assassinates Caesar Augustus, and he's the emperor, of course, when Jesus is born. You probably knew that already. All right. So, John Green says, really, the Roman Republic was over long before Julius Caesar or Caesar Augustus ever came to power. And there definitely is some evidence for that. The Senate, as they gave more and more power to the consuls, became less and less important. It became much more of an oligarchy and then much more of a dictatorship long before Julius Caesar was even born. But it was Julius Caesar who kind of pushed it to that limit, who said, I will take all the power for myself and I will remain in power for life. That was a huge step for one guy to step up and say, I will take the power for myself and I will stay in power for life. He was the first one to really do that. They killed him. And then 20 years later, Caesar Augustus comes in and says, nah, I think that was a good idea that Julius had there. We'll do that again, and this time you're not going to kill me. So he does end up being successful. What's important about that, historically, is that it's the end of the rule of law and the beginning of the rule of men. So instead of there being laws made by the Senate that frame how the government is to be run, you have a man who dictates terms to everybody else. So you go from a Senate and the rule of law to a dictator and a dictatorship. And that will be part of the weakening of the Roman Empire, because a nation of laws is more just and more stable than a nation that is ruled by men who are not under the law, but who instead become the law, right? Okay, that's all we're going to cover for now. We're going to take about a 10-minute break, and then we'll get back together for Christianity and the fall of Rome. All right. See you then.